What would you do if HOA Karen called 911 on you the moment you parked on your own land? They called 911 thinking I was trespassing on my own place. They swore the whole lake belonged to the HOA. The whole neighborhood stayed silent, too scared to speak. But old deeds, forgotten maps, and the truth about their dirty money flipped everything. I just wanted peace, but they had no idea I owned far more than a lake house. The gravel crunched under the tires of my old silver pickup as I eased it down the narrow road that curved along the northern edge of Windmere Lake. The sun was barely over the ridge, casting a soft orange wash across the water. My small aluminum fishing boat, strapped tight to the trailer, clattered gently behind me. It was the kind of Wyoming morning that usually quieted every thought in my head, the kind of morning I'd been craving for months. Clean air, cold light, the faint smell of pine drifting across the lake. I slowed as the house came into view. My new place, a weather-worn cabin built from thick logs darkened by time and storms, resting just above the riprap shoreline. A simple wooden gate marked the entrance, the hinges still solid despite a bit of rust. I remember thinking the place felt honest, like it had seen things and held them quietly. The lake glimmered behind it, calm, stretching out toward the opposite banks where the trees thickened into a deep green line. I'd barely turned off the ignition when I saw someone marching across the street toward me. A woman, middle-aged, stiff posture, blonde hair tied so tight it looked painful. She wore a bright pink windbreaker and held a clipboard as if it were a badge of office. Her stride was sharp enough to cut through metal, the kind of march you see in people who believe their footsteps carry authority. I swung down from the truck, stretching my back after the long drive from Cheyenne. Before I could even take in the view again, her voice hit me, high, slicing, carrying across the quiet road like a siren. "Excuse me! Excuse me! You can't park that here." I blinked, honestly unsure she was talking to me. There was no one else around, though, just the breeze rolling through the aspens and the faint slap of water against the rocks. I raised a polite hand. "Morning. I'm Remy. Just moving in." She didn't return the greeting. She didn't even look at my hand. Her eyes scanned me from boots to jacket like she was inspecting livestock and finding it lacking. "This road," she snapped, tapping her clipboard, "is managed by the Lakeshore HOA. You cannot obstruct it. Where are your authorization papers?" "Authorization for moving into my own place?" I asked slowly. "I closed on the property last week." She scoffed, an ugly clipped sound. "Impossible. That cabin belongs to the association until ownership is reviewed and approved. You can't just show up with a fishing boat and claim it." I stared at her, trying to piece together whether I'd met her somewhere before, or if this was genuinely how she introduced herself to people. "Ma'am, the deed is in my truck. I can show you." "No," she snapped. "You need to step away from the driveway immediately. This isn't a public campground. This is private community property." The cold irritation in my chest tightened. I looked at the cabin, my cabin, and back at this stranger who seemed ready to build a barricade out of pure indignation. But before I could respond, she lifted her phone in an exaggerated arch of her arm. "If you refuse to comply," she said, already dialing, "I will be contacting law enforcement. Now." "You're calling the police?" I asked, genuinely stunned. "For me standing on my own land?" "That is not your land," she barked. "This is HOA protected shoreline, and you are trespassing." And before I could get another word out, before I could reach the glove box and pull out the stack of closing documents, she pressed the phone to her ear and said, loud enough for the entire lake to hear, "Yes, 911? I need officers dispatched immediately. There's a man illegally occupying restricted property." I felt something in me go still. Not angry, not confused, just still. Because I'd dealt with people like this before. People who weaponize their voices, their titles, their imagined authority. They bark, and they expect the world to jump. But this time was different, and she didn't know it. The dispatcher's reply drifted faintly from her phone as I set my jaw and leaned against the open truck door. I watched the woman, who had not yet given me her name, pace the edge of my driveway like a border guard patrolling sacred ground. The lake carried her voice across the water. Birds stopped singing. Even the breeze seemed to pause, waiting. And then, far down the road, a small echo of sirens began to rise. My hands curled into fists, then slowly loosened. I breathed in the cold lake air, letting it settle into me, letting it cool the heat building under my ribs. It took the sheriff's SUV 3 minutes to pull up. Red and blue lights flashed against the logs of the cabin, bouncing across the glassy water. The door opened, and Sheriff Marcus Hale stepped out, broad-shouldered, trim-beard, eyes already narrowed with tired recognition. He looked from Bethany to me, then back to her, and sighed the sigh of a man who'd seen this exact performance many times before. "Mrs. Reed," he said flatly, "what's the emergency this time?" So that was her name. Bethany Reed, the HOA president, the self-appointed guardian of the lake. She pointed at me dramatically. "This man is trespassing on restricted HOA property. He refuses to leave." Marcus looked at me. "That true?" "No, sir," I said. "I just moved in. Deed and closing papers are in the truck. Want to see them?" His jaw tightened with something between annoyance and resignation. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I better." As I reached into the cab for the envelope, I felt Bethany's eyes drilling holes into my back. Her breath was sharp, indignant, pressing against the silence. But beneath it all, beneath the sirens, beneath her accusation, beneath the cold Wyoming morning, I felt something else rising quietly inside me. Not fear, not anger, awareness. Because I knew something Bethany Reed didn't. She thought she was looking at a trespasser. She thought she was catching some fool who stumbled into her little kingdom. But as I handed Marcus the deed and the sheriff stared at the official signatures, I looked out over the shimmering blue water behind my cabin. And I reminded myself of what I'd spent the last 6 months doing. They thought I owned one lake house. They didn't know what else I had bought. Sheriff Marcus Hale held the deed up to the light filtering between the pines, his eyes scanning the signatures with a quiet patience that suggested he'd read more property disputes than murder reports. The man didn't say much, but he didn't have to, huh? His silence had weight. Beside him, Bethany Reed stood stiff as a fence post, arms crossed, lips pinched so tight they seemed to disappear into her face. The breeze coming off Windmere Lake picked up, scattering a faint mist over the rocks. My boat trailer creaked softly as the water slapped the shoreline. Everything around us was calm, except the woman who was currently vibrating like a tea kettle seconds from boiling over. Marcus lowered the papers. "These look legitimate to me," he said, his voice even. "Closing occurred last week. Documents recorded with the county." Bethany let out a dramatic bark of laughter. "Oh, please. Anyone can print papers off the internet nowadays. That doesn't mean he owns shoreline property in this community." She tapped her clipboard like she was summoning lightning. "Windmere Lake and all adjacent access roads belong to the Lakeshore Homeowners Association, Sheriff. This man is either confused or attempting something fraudulent." Marcus rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Bethany, we've talked about this. County records outrank HOA binders." She ignored him, the way a runaway horse ignores reins. She stepped toward me, her perfume, something floral and expensive, cutting through the cool air. "You need to vacate immediately before further action is taken." I looked down at the deed in Marcus's hands. "Ma'am, respectfully, this land is mine. The cabin, the shoreline easement, the access path, everything is recorded." Bethany scoffed loudly. The path is part of the association, and the lake, that is community water. No individual owns lake rights here. It's all spelled out in our bylaws. She held up a thick stack of papers bound with a pink ribbon. Every resident is required to follow them. I kept my voice calm. Funny thing about bylaws, they work only where they apply and only if they follow state statutes. Marcus shot me a quick glance like he wasn't sure whether I was hinting at something or bluffing. I wasn't bluffing. I just wasn't ready to lay everything out yet. Bethany exhaled sharply through her nose. Sheriff, I want him cited for trespassing. The sheriff's jaw tightened. Bethany, I cannot cite a man for standing on property he legally purchased. He hasn't shown me the deed, she snapped. You're not the county recorder, he replied. Bethany's cheeks reddened, the flush crawling up her neck. She spun around, waving her arms toward the lake. This is incredible. This entire northwestern bank belongs to the association. It was developed as part of the Lakeshore Restoration Initiative back in 1989. It's in our archive. She strode to the edge of my driveway like she was claiming victory ground. Everything from the boat ramp to the shoreline fence to the maintenance shed is HOA property. Do you understand? This area is protected. Her words came out hard and brittle, breaking against the stillness of the lake. I walked toward her, boots crunching on gravel. Protected by whom? The developer who folded in '94? Or the HOA that wasn't officially filed until '97? Her head snapped toward me so fast I thought she might strain something. What nonsense are you talking about? I shrugged lightly. Just interesting history. This lake's boundaries have shifted a few times. You ever look at the original plats? For the first time, something flickered behind her eyes. Annoyance? Confusion? A shadow of uncertainty? She dismissed it with a dramatic flick of her hand. Sheriff, I want him removed from the premises. Now. Marcus blew out a slow breath, one that said he regretted waking up this morning. Bethany, I'm not removing a lawful property owner who hasn't committed a crime. She jabbed the air with her clipboard. You don't understand. If we let this go, every rule we enforce becomes meaningless. The association is responsible for the integrity of this shoreline. And if he thinks he can just drag in a fishing boat and... Before she could finish, a gust of wind swept across the water, flipping open the edge of her ribbon-bound bylaws. A loose page fluttered to the ground at my feet. I bent and picked it up, glancing at the scrawled, faded print. The document wasn't a bylaw. It was an old map. An old one. Marcus leaned over my shoulder just enough to see it. Where'd that come from? From our records, Bethany said, snatching it back like a jealous magpie. And they are private. I shouldn't have seen it. But I did. And there it was, clear even through the light blur of time-worn ink, an outline tracing the lake boundary, and a faint marking along the northern edge labeled exempt, deeded prior to HOA formation. My land, my shoreline, my access path, an area the HOA never had authority over. The realization pushed through me like a pulse of static. She had no idea. Not yet. Bethany folded the map back into her bundle, holding the papers against her chest as if they could shield her from reality. Sheriff, if you don't act, we will escalate this. The board will not let this stand. Marcus looked at me, then at the lake, then back at her. Bethany, you need to stop calling 911 over civil matters. This is not an emergency. It is an emergency, she shouted. He's claiming ownership of community assets. I stepped forward just enough for her to hear me clearly. I'm not claiming anything I don't own. She glared at me, steady and burning. We will see about that. Marcus cleared his throat. We're done here. Mrs. Reed, if you keep harassing this man without cause, we'll have a different kind of conversation. She stared at him like he'd betrayed her personally, then turned her fury back toward me. The wind blew strands of hair from her tightly pulled ponytail, and she tucked them behind her ear with jerky, angry motions. "You think you're moving into a peaceful lakeside home?" she hissed. "You're mistaken. I will not allow you to disrupt this community." I gave her a small, tired smile. "Ma'am, I'm just here to live quietly." She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, she spun on her heel and strode back toward her house with the stiffness of an offended monarch. When she disappeared behind a hedge, Marcus turned to me. "Word of advice, Remy." He tapped the deed. "Keep this close for a while." "I intend to," I said. He nodded once, then climbed into his SUV and drove off, leaving only the faint smell of dust and engine heat behind. When the road grew quiet again and I was finally alone, I leaned against the truck, watching the lake shimmer like hammered silver. The world felt still, but my mind wasn't. That old map, those faint boundary lines, something wasn't adding up. And if Bethany was, this worked up about me moving into one cabin. I couldn't imagine how she'd react when she learned the truth, because the lake didn't belong to the association. It never had, and she had no idea how deep that went. The rest of the afternoon unfolded under a heavy, unsettled quiet. I unloaded boxes from the bed of the truck, the wooden planks thumping beneath my boots, the air smelling of pine sap and distant rain. The mountains across the lake stood in layered shades of blue, the peaks hazy, like they were watching everything but refusing to speak. Every few minutes, I caught myself glancing up the road, half expecting Bethany to reappear and declare some new violation involving cardboard boxes or the direction the tires faced. But no one came. The silence was almost eerie. I carried a box labeled kitchen, fragile through the front door. The hinges creaked in a tired, honest way that made the place feel more lived in than abandoned. Inside, the cabin opened into a wide room with exposed beams and a stone fireplace darkened by decades of smoke. Dust motes drifted through the air like tiny floating seeds. The wooden floorboards groaned under my steps, but not in protest, more like they were greeting me, acknowledging my arrival. I set the box down on the counter and glanced out the broad back windows. The lake spread out wide and glassy, reflecting the thin clouds drifting overhead. A couple of ducks paddled near the reeds. The world looked peaceful again, almost deceptively so. But there was movement across the street. I stepped closer to the window. A few neighbors had trickled out of their houses after the sheriff left, clustering near their mailboxes or pretending to water plants that clearly didn't need watering. They weren't watching the scenery. They were watching me, trying to look casual while sneaking glances every few seconds. One guy leaned against a weathered fishing boat in his driveway, arms crossed. Another older woman, silver hair pinned neatly, stood behind a screen door, staring with a tight-lipped expression. A pair of teenagers rode past on bikes, not speaking, just silently rubbernecking before vanishing around the curve. Not one of them waved. Not a nod, not a smile, not a "welcome to the lake." Just silence. A silence carved from fear. I grabbed another box and stepped back outside. The wind shifted, sending a ripple across the water and a faint whistle through the pines. The sound filled the space where neighborly voices should have been. As I hoisted the box onto my shoulder, a man across the street took a hesitant step toward me. He was maybe mid-40s, sun-browned skin, a baseball cap pulled low. He paused halfway down his driveway, glanced over his shoulder like he wasn't sure if someone was watching him, then crossed the road. "Hey, you're the new guy," he said quietly, stopping a few feet away. I set the box down. "Remy, just moved in today." He shook his head slowly. "Hell of a welcome you got." His voice carried weariness, the kind that came from seeing the same problem repeat itself over and over. He extended his hand. "Name's Pete. I heard the shouting, and the sirens." "Yeah," I said. "Not exactly what I expected this morning." Pete huffed out a breath. Nobody ever expects Bethany. She comes at you like a summer hailstorm, fast, loud, and out of nowhere. I nodded toward the small clusters of neighbors pretending not to watch us. They all scared of her? He followed my gaze and shrugged. Scared enough. He rubbed the back of his neck. Look, don't take it personal. Folks around here learned a long time ago that standing up to her costs more than it's worth. She fines people for grass height, dock lights, mailbox colors. Once fined the Johnsons $3,000 for a decorative wagon wheel she claimed was visual pollution. I raised an eyebrow. A wagon wheel? Yeah, he said dryly. It wasn't even on her side of the street. Wind rustled through the aspens behind us, the leaves shimmering silver as they flipped. Pete glanced toward Bethany's house, a tall, beige structure with manicured shrubs aligned like soldiers, and lowered his voice further. She's been running this place for 11 years. Calls the sheriff so often Marcus jokes he should install a red phone in his office just for her. He sighed. We all tried fighting her once. Board elections, petitions, appeals to the county. Didn't matter. She always found some technicality or some friend in the right office to slam the door shut. I leaned against the truck bed. Ever ask why she's so determined to control the lake? Pete hesitated. His eyes shifted toward the water, narrowing. Some folks say she's protecting property values. Others think she just likes power, but... He paused, chewing on the thought. Most of us figure she's hiding something. She fights too hard for someone who's supposedly just preserving the community. You don't see this level of obsession unless there's something to lose. I let his words hang in the air. You believe that? After what she's done? He nodded. Yeah, I believe it. Another gust swept across the lake, rippling the surface and tossing stray pine needles into the air. Pete shoved his hands in his pockets. Anyway, welcome to Windmere Lake. If you ever need a hand, folks'll help. Just quietly. He walked back toward his place, his shoulders sagging under some invisible weight. I finished unloading boxes until the sun dipped low, staining the lake gold and amber. The stillness grew heavier as the last neighbor slipped back indoors. Even the birds quieted, as though they understood something was off. Inside the cabin, I spread the closing documents across the dining table. The paper smelled faintly of toner and dust. I ran my fingers over the map again, the same kind Bethany had clutched earlier, but mine wasn't smudged or dog-eared. The clean survey lines traced the north shore, the access paths, the inlets, and the exclusions, the old exclusions, the ones predating the HOA. I sat there for a long while, listening to the lake lap against the rocks just outside the window. Each wave broke softly, like it carried some secret murmured through time. A secret half the neighborhood had been conditioned not to question. Pete's words replayed in my head. She's hiding something. Maybe she was. Or maybe the truth had been buried under years of intimidation and bureaucracy, left undisturbed like a relic under lake silt. But I hadn't bought a relic. I'd bought land, and I'd bought the history beneath it. I stacked the papers neatly and leaned back, staring out the window as the moon began rising over the ridge, washing the shoreline in silver. The cabin felt heavier now, not oppressive but full of expectation, like the walls themselves knew this home wasn't like the others on the street. Something was shifting at Windmere Lake. Something old. Something legal. Something the HOA had never intended anyone to dig up. And sitting there in the quiet, watching the moon shimmer across the water, I understood one thing with cold clarity. Nobody stood up to Bethany Reed because nobody had ever had the means. But I did. The next morning broke with a pale golden haze drifting over the lake, the water perfectly smooth except for the occasional ripple from trout rising near the reeds. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, the steam curling in the cold air. The cabin porch creaked under my weight as I leaned on the railing, watching the fog lift from the shoreline like a curtain revealing a stage. The world looked peaceful again. It always did first thing in the morning, but yesterday's scene still clung to the air like the smell of smoke after a brush fire. I could feel it in my shoulders, in the tightness at the base of my neck. Bethany had set something in motion, and she wasn't going to let it go. People like her never did. The coffee was still halfway full when I heard tires crunching gravel. A white Subaru with a roof rack pulled up the narrow road and parked just outside my gate. I recognized it immediately. Sarah Mitchell stepped out. Jeans, a dark blazer, hair pulled loosely over one shoulder. She carried a leather folder under one arm, the kind that always seemed to hold more power than its size suggested. She worked as a land use attorney in Laramie. Smart, level-headed, stubborn as a fence post. The kind of person you called when paperwork got messy, or when someone tried to claim land that wasn't theirs. I'd known her for years, long enough to trust her, but short enough to know she appreciated brevity. She gave the cabin a quick once-over as she walked toward me. "You sure know how to pick the quiet places, Remy." "Quiet yesterday morning," I said. "Not so much by noon." She set her folder on the porch railing and folded her arms. "I heard some of it. Sheriff Hale called me last night. Said you had an HOA president trying to annex your oxygen supply." I smirked. "Sounds about right." "You ready to tell me what really happened?" she asked. There was no judgment in her voice, just that low, professional calm she carried everywhere. I gestured toward the table just inside the cabin. "Come on in." Inside, sunlight cut through the windows and lit up the documents still spread across my dining table from the night before. Deeds, plats, water rights certificates, survey maps, paper arranged in organized chaos. The old cabin smelled like warm pine and coffee, with a hint of dust rising as the heater kicked on. Sarah approached the table, flipping the corner of a survey with one finger. "You've been doing some digging." "More than digging," I said. "I spent 6 months gathering these." She opened the leather folder and took out a binder, laying it gently beside my stack. "This is everything I could pull quickly. The county archives, the old developer filings. Took half the night." I shook my head. "You didn't have to do it that fast." She shot me a look. "You think I'm going to let an HOA president with a clipboard try to bulldoze you? I've seen people like her. They don't stop until they hit a wall." Her hand tapped the binder. "We're that wall." She opened it to a folded map, yellowed, creased, edges brittle. The paper whispered when she spread it flat across the table. "This," she said, "is the original land survey when Windermere Lake was still under the state's jurisdiction, before the Lakeshore HOA existed." The ink showed a shoreline similar to what existed today, but with a critical difference. A stretch of the northern bank was outlined in red. I tapped it lightly. "Exempt land?" "Exactly." She traced the boundary with a pen. "This parcel, your cabin, the shoreline path, the launch point for your boat, was deeded to private hands in 1952, long before the HOA was created. It was never pulled into the association's authority." "Bethany thinks it was," I said. "She can think anything she wants." Sarah flipped a page. "But the law doesn't." Her eyes sharpened as she turned to another document, a chain of title record dating back 70 years. "Here's where it gets interesting, Remy. Property law doesn't just care about current ownership. It cares about the entire chain. And this chain shows something she doesn't expect." She slid the deed toward me. The name at the bottom made my pulse thrum. "This parcel and several adjacent lots passed through only 3 owners in 7 decades, she said. "And the last transfer? The one from the estate sale last month? It didn't just give you this cabin." I felt the air shift around me, the lake breeze filtering through the cracked window. "How many parcels are we talking about?" "Multiple," she said. all tied to one corporate entity. I met her eyes. She already knew. Mine, I said. Yours, she confirmed. The room felt suddenly heavier, anchored by the truth on the table. Sarah leaned her hip against the counter, arms folded. Remy, you don't just own a cabin. You own the entire deeded shoreline on the north side of Windmere Lake, including the access road Bethany claimed was association property. And the launch point, she said, was community-owned. I let out a slow breath. I knew there was more, but I didn't realize how much. She nodded. She has no jurisdiction here. None. And once she finds that out, she's going to panic. A gust of wind rattled the cabin windows, as if punctuating the point. Sarah tapped the red-marked portion of the map again. But that's not the biggest issue for her. She pulled out another folded page, the HOA charter itself. Look here. The association was formed in '97, and they used boundaries from an inaccurate survey. She slid the two maps together. When overlaid, half of what they've been claiming is HOA property isn't. They've been collecting dues and issuing fines to people they have no authority over? I asked. Sarah's expression hardened. For years. Nobody questioned it because they didn't know, and Bethany sure didn't tell them. Outside, a boat engine hummed faintly somewhere across the water, a low, steady sound that faded just as quickly as it rose. The lake was returning to its morning calm. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere had thickened with something deeper, anticipation. Sarah closed the folder softly. What happened yesterday? That was just the opening move, and she doesn't realize she's playing on your board. I leaned back against the dining chair, hands gripping the wooden frame. She's not going to stop, not until someone forces her to. She's never been forced before, Sarah said. But you have the documents. You have the chain of title. And you have something nobody else here ever did. Leverage. I stared at the survey lines in silence, the ink etched into the paper like scars. The wind outside rustled through the tall grass near the water, making a soft, restless whisper. When do we show her? I asked. Sarah smiled, but it was the kind of smile forged in courtrooms. Not warm, not soft, but precise. When she makes her next mistake. A shadow moved past the window, footsteps on gravel. A familiar sharp silhouette came into view, clipboard tucked beneath one arm. Bethany Reed, marching straight toward the cabin with purpose. She's early, Sarah murmured. I took a breath, slow and steady, letting the cool air fill my lungs. The lake shimmered in my peripheral vision, its surface bright and deceptive. She thinks she's coming to warn me, I said. Sarah closed her binder with a soft, deliberate snap. Let her. I stood, feeling something shift inside me. A steadiness, a cold focus. Because she had no idea what papers were waiting on this table. No idea what was written in that chain of title. No idea who owned what. And no idea how deep this went. Bethany's sharp footsteps crunched across the gravel like snapping twigs under a boot. Even through the closed windows, Sarah and I could hear that aggressive cadence. Quick, clipped, rehearsed. The kind of walk meant to announce arrival long before the fist hits the door. I watched her silhouette move past the porch railing. The morning sun lit up her bright jacket like a collision flare on a dark highway. Sarah moved to the side of the dining table, quietly closing the binder of survey maps. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture did. She shifted from relaxed into ready, the same way a seasoned attorney straightens her shoulders before stepping into a courtroom. I stood a moment longer, letting my breath settle. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps that rattled the old wooden door on its hinges. I opened it. Bethany already had a paper in one hand, the clipboard in the other, chin high, jaw tight. Mr. Cole, she announced, as if addressing a crowd behind me instead of a man standing 10 inches from her. I am issuing formal violations based on this morning's review of your property. It's not even 9 a.m., I said. I start my rounds at sunrise, she replied proudly, as though that made her sound dedicated rather than intrusive. And what I found is deeply troubling. She shoved the first paper at me. A fluorescent orange sheet, stamped with the HOA emblem, and the words "Violation Notice" in bold letters. Your boat trailer is parked in an unapproved zone, she said. This is a safety hazard. The trailer is on my driveway, I replied. Incorrect. It is adjacent to the association access road. The access road, I said calmly, is part of my deed. Her eye twitched. She didn't like that. Not one bit. So she pushed another sheet at me. Your cabin's gate is non-conforming to HOA standards. It is rustic. Rustic is not an approved style category. I stared at her. It's a wooden gate. It opens. It closes. It's a gate. It disrupts aesthetic continuity, she said sharply. She handed me another brightly colored sheet. Your porch light is too dim. Your roofline overhang is not measured. And, she paused, flipping the stack dramatically. Your behavior toward association leadership yesterday was hostile. I blinked. By existing? By questioning established authority, she snapped. Behind me, Sarah leaned against the doorway, her arms crossed, watching Bethany with an expression one might reserve for a coyote sniffing around a chicken coop. Calm, unbothered, but ready to strike if needed. Bethany saw her and stiffened. And who might you be? A friend, Sarah said, voice cool as the lake at dawn. And an attorney. Bethany's nostrils flared. So you've already retained legal counsel? That alone speaks volumes about your intentions here. My intentions, I said softly, are to live on my property in peace. She made an exaggerated laugh, the kind that didn't sound like amusement, but like agitation pushed through clenched teeth. Peace is earned by cooperating with the HOA, Mr. Cole. You seem to think you are exempt from our rules. Sarah stepped forward slightly. Depends on which rules, and who they actually apply to. Bethany's jaw snapped toward her. Our rules apply to everyone. Sarah smiled, not warmly, but with surgical precision. That's not what the county records say. Bethany blinked, visibly, just once. But it was enough to confirm what Pete had implied. She liked control, but she despised uncertainty. And Sarah had just introduced uncertainty like a snake in her garden. Bethany collected herself quickly. I'll be back with more formal notices. This is just the preliminary list. You can expect additional fines throughout the day. She turned and marched away without waiting for a response. Halfway down the path, she stopped, turning sharply toward the shoreline as if checking that the lake hadn't shifted overnight. Then she snapped a picture of my boat with her phone. When she disappeared around the bend of the road, the air finally loosened in my chest. Sarah exhaled. She's escalating fast. She's scrambling, I said, stepping out onto the porch. She doesn't know which part of this she should panic over yet, so she's panicking over everything. We walked down the steps toward the driveway. That's when I saw it. A small, newly installed security camera mounted on a pole near the bushes across the street. Its lens pointed directly at my front door like an unblinking black eye. A thin red light pulsed in its housing. Sarah followed my gaze. Let me guess. HOA surveillance? I nodded. That wasn't there last night. She crouched slightly, inspecting it without touching. Cheap model, but it records and streams. Then she pointed at another, and another. 4 cameras total, each pointed at different angles of my property. Bethany hadn't wasted time. She'd installed them early, likely before she even knocked on my door. She's documenting everything, Sarah said, or trying to intimidate you. She's trying to build a case, I replied. But she doesn't realize the foundation under her is rotten. The wind swept across the lake with a low, whistling hum. Pine branches swayed overhead. The scent of cold water and cedar drifted into the open space around us. Inside the cabin, the phone buzzed. I walked in and picked it up. A new email from an unknown HOA account. Subject: Non-compliance warning. Immediate action required 6 additional violations, identified fine. Total $1,400. I read each line carefully. One violation claimed my trash cans were visible from the road. Another accused me of unapproved vegetation, wild rose shrubs that were native and had likely been here long before the HOA existed. There was even a violation for potential noise disturbance, citing no specific event. Sarah read over my shoulder. She's padding the file so thick, she thinks she can smother you with it. Let her, I said. Because fines were nothing. Paper was nothing. The real weight sat on my dining table in the form of 70-year-old legal documents and the chain of title she never bothered to research. I walked to the window, watching the cameras blink like tiny eyes watching every move. Bethany was trying to build a mountain, but she didn't know I'd already dug out the land beneath it. And soon, it would collapse under its own weight. The lake glimmered in the late morning sun, the reflection bright enough to make me squint. The wind calmed for a moment, leaving the water flat as polished glass. It was the kind of stillness that came just before everything shifted. Sarah had left about an hour earlier, taking the back road toward Laramie with the binder of scanned documents safely buckled in the passenger seat. Before driving off, she'd told me one thing in that steady courtroom voice of hers: let her move first. So that's what I did. I waited. The day unfolded in a strange, suspended quiet. I stacked boxes in the cabin. I wiped down the counters. I swept away spiderwebs in the loft. Yet every movement felt like I was tiptoeing through someone else's house, even though the deed said otherwise. Every so often, I'd catch myself looking out the window toward the road, half expecting another burst of fluorescent violation notices to appear like invasive weeds, but none came. Not immediately. By noon, a soft weight settled over the lakeshore, one of those warm, hushed midday calms when the mountains block the harsher winds and everything grows dense with the smell of sun-heated pine. The vast Wyoming sky stretched empty and blue, broken only by a passing hawk circling above the tree line. The stillness felt heavy, as if even the air were bracing itself. I carried a crate of tools out to the porch and set it on the railing. The wood felt warm under my hands, seeped through with decades of weather. A moment later, I heard the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. Not hurried like Bethany's, not hesitant like the neighbors. This was something in between. Curious. Pete stood at the edge of the driveway, hands in his pockets. His fishing hat shaded part of his face, and his boots were dusty from the shoreline path. He gave a small nod. Heard you had visitors again this morning? Word travels fast around here, I said. Pete stepped closer. It does when the HOA president marches around like she works for the Department of Homeland Security. Folks know when she's on the warpath. He paused. You holding up all right? Fine, I said. Just trying to figure out how many violations I'll rack up by sunset. Pete snorted. Depends on her mood. Last 4th of July, she fined the Hendersons for unapproved spark generation. That was just their grill. The wind picked up slightly, shaking the aspens so their leaves whispered like a soft warning. Pete watched me for a moment, weighing his next words. When he spoke, his voice was lower, steadier. She won't let this go, Remy. You understand that, right? I figured as much. She's been itching for another fight. And you, well, you're new. You don't scare easy. That alone is enough to set her off. I glanced at the lake. Doesn't matter what she wants. The paperwork's solid. Pete hesitated again, then leaned slightly closer. Most people here, we learn to stay quiet. Keep our heads down. Pay the fines. Mow the grass to her standards. Repaint the deck to her palate. It's easier than going to war. I'm not looking for a war, I said. He shook his head. You don't have to. She'll bring it to your door on her own. We stood in silence for a moment. The lake shimmered, shifting from silver to pale blue as the sun climbed higher. A faint ripple spread across its surface, widening into a long, slow-moving wake, even though no boat was in sight. Windermere Lake had a way of carrying sound and motion from far distances. Everything echoed out here. Pete tapped the porch rail lightly. Just thought you should know. Folks are watching. Some of them are rooting for you, even if they're scared to say so. I nodded. I appreciate it. He gave me a half smile, touched the brim of his cap, and headed back toward his place. His footsteps faded into the rustle of the tall grass. The quiet returned, heavier now. Around 2, another email from the HOA rolled in. This time not a fine, but a notice. Mandatory special meeting. All residents required tonight. 7:30 p.m. Lakeshore Community Center. I stared at the message. The tone was commanding, urgent, and laced with the kind of authority people use when they fear losing their grip. At 3, movement flickered at the end of the road. I watched from the porch as Bethany emerged from her gate carrying a stack of folders. She was pacing, fast, agitated, her lips moving in silent arguments with herself. The wind carried faint bits of her voice. He can't. Not legal. Board will. She walked in circles, clutching the folders so tight her knuckles turned white. She hadn't come to issue more fines. She hadn't come to bark accusations. She hadn't come to demand a meeting on my porch. She was rattled, deeply rattled. And the reason sat in my dining room, the chain of title proving her power didn't extend nearly as far as she believed. But the real silence came from inside her house. Behind her, the curtains shifted once, just an inch, revealing a shadowy figure watching her from the living room. A man. Her husband, maybe. Older. Shoulders slumped. He watched her pace like someone who'd lived this scene 1,000 times. He said nothing. He didn't come out. He just watched. The silence between them felt louder than her shouting ever had. As the afternoon stretched on, clouds rolled in from the west, streaking the sky with dark brushstrokes. The wind picked up, and the lake grew restless, churning in small, rolling waves that tapped against the rocks. The stillness had cracked. At 5, as thunder rumbled faintly beyond the ridge, Sarah called. Just got off the phone with the clerk's office. Everything's confirmed. The chain of title is airtight. Wherever this goes tonight, you're protected. Tonight, I repeated. Bethany booked a mandatory meeting, Sarah said. She doesn't do that unless she's feeling threatened. The first drops of rain hit the wooden railing, slow and heavy. Sounds like she's preparing a show. She is, Sarah paused. Let her think she's in control. Let her say everything she wants to say. When she's done, her voice hardened. We'll give her what she didn't expect. When the call ended, I stood on the porch and watched the rain gather strength, falling harder against the dirt path leading to the cabin. The lake darkened, turning the color of gunmetal beneath the storm clouds. The world was no longer quiet. The air hummed with something building, something that had been waiting a long time to break loose at Windermere Lake. Because HOA presidents can wield clipboards and fines all day. But storms don't obey bylaws, and neither did land deeds written 70 years ago. The rain thickened, drumming on the roof, washing the dust from the porch. The wind picked up, slicing through the pines with a low, angry whistle. I watched the lake churn and the road blur beneath the downpour. The stillness was gone. The shift had begun. By the time the storm eased off, the world outside had turned a deep blue gray, the kind of dusk that comes early in the mountains. Puddles shimmered in the lane. The wet bark of the pines looked almost black. A cold mist drifted upward from the lake like a ghost rising slowly from the shoreline. At 7 o'clock p.m., I stepped out onto the porch, wearing a clean jacket and carrying the same folder Bethany feared, but didn't yet know the contents of. My boots sank slightly into the softened dirt as I walked toward the road. The community center sat at the top of the hill, a squat log building with a tin roof that pinged faintly as the last drops of stormwater fell. As I approached, voices spilled out into the evening. Dozens of them, layered with irritation, confusion, unease. People didn't usually show up for HOA meetings unless something was wrong. Tonight, the gravel lot was full. Pickup trucks, minivans, a few tired sedans. Their headlights made pale yellow cones in the damp air. I reached the door just as it swung open, and a resident hurried out, shaking water from his jacket. He gave me a quick glance, hesitant, uncertain, then slipped past without a word. Inside, the room was packed. Folding chairs creaked under shifting bodies. Damp jackets steamed. The smell of wet wool and pine sap clung to the air. At the front of the room stood Bethany Reed. Her hair was perfectly smoothed back, not a strand out of place despite the rain. A stack of folders towered on the table beside her, each one labeled with bright stickers. She gripped her clipboard like a judge about to pass sentence. When she saw me enter, her spine straightened so sharply it was as if she'd absorbed a jolt of electricity. "Mr. Cole," she called out loudly, ensuring every head turned. "How nice of you to join us." Dozens of eyes swung my way, some apologetic, some curious, many fearful. I walked down the center aisle, my boots thudding softly against the wooden floor, and took a seat in the third row. Bethany cleared her throat, tapping her pen against the clipboard. The hollow, sharp sound echoed. "We are here tonight," she began, "because of a serious breach of community compliance by one specific homeowner." Murmurs rippled through the room. She continued, "This homeowner has refused to acknowledge association authority, violated multiple property standards, threatened the harmony of our community, and—" I raised a brow. That was quite the buildup. "And has falsely claimed ownership of common HOA property." Now the room stirred more loudly. Some whispered, others stiffened. Bethany lifted a stack of bright violation papers as if they were sacred artifacts. "In just 24 hours, we have identified more than 20 infractions, which, combined, constitute grounds for legal action and potential removal from the community." Her gaze locked onto me with a cold, triumphant glare. She expected me to shrink in my seat. I didn't move. She pressed on. "Before we open the floor, I would like to remind everyone that our HOA jurisdiction covers the lake shoreline, the access road, and all parcels adjacent to the community dock." She flicked to a laminated map. "This map shows our authority. It has been accepted here for nearly 30 years, Sarah's voice cut in. Every head swung toward the back of the room. She stepped inside, hair damp from rain, binder tucked under her arm, confidence trailing behind her like a second shadow. Her heels clicked against the floor with a rhythm that sounded like inevitability. Bethany's jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jump from across the room. "This meeting is for residents only," she snapped. "Legal representation is not required." "She's with me," I said calmly. Sarah walked down the aisle, took a seat beside me, and placed her binder gently on the table in front of us. The soft thud echoed louder than Bethany's entire speech. Bethany's smile tightened. "Well, since our guest insists on attending, let's proceed." She tapped her clipboard again. "As I was saying, this map shows our long-standing authority over the lake and the—" "May I approach?" Sarah asked politely. Bethany scoffed. "No." Sarah stood anyway. She walked to the front, heels clicking lightly, and laid a single sheet from her binder on the table. The room leaned forward instinctively. "This is the original 1952 survey," she said, "filed with the county 35 years before this HOA existed." Bethany's nostrils flared. "Irrelevant." Sarah ignored her. With calm precision, she placed Bethany's laminated HOA map directly beside the old survey. "Here is the old shoreline boundary," she said, pointing with the end of her pen. "And here is the boundary the HOA claims today." People in the room squinted, leaning closer. The difference was obvious even without a trained eye. Sarah tapped the old map again. "This section," she circled the northern shoreline in red, "was privately deeded long before the HOA was created. It remained under private ownership through every transfer." Bethany's voice pitched upward. "That land is HOA property." Sarah turned, eyebrows raised. "On what legal basis?" Bethany opened and closed her mouth. On the basis of community continuity and historical—" "That isn't law," Sarah replied. A few residents murmured. One man whispered, "I never knew that shoreline wasn't HOA." Bethany slammed her folder shut. "Enough! This is an HOA meeting, not a courtroom." "No," Sarah said softly. "This is a room full of people who've been misled." Then she placed the chain of title record on the table. The ink glinted under the overhead lights. "This document," she said, "shows continuous ownership of the deeded parcels along the North Shore. And the owner of those parcels, as of 3 weeks ago, is—" Bethany shouted, "This is outrageous!" "Remy Cole," Sarah finished firmly. The room went silent. The kind of silence that drops like a stone into deep water. Heavy, impossible to ignore. My heartbeat didn't even quicken. I'd known this moment would come. But seeing it land, seeing the shock ripple across faces hardened by years of fear, seeing the shift in their eyes as the truth surfaced, it hit harder than I expected. Bethany shook her head, frantic. He can't. He can't own all that. It's impossible. That land is part of the community." Sarah folded her hands. "It never was." A man in the back stood slowly. "Are you saying she's been fining us for using land that doesn't belong to the HOA?" "I'm saying," Sarah replied, "that the HOA claimed authority it never legally had." Voices erupted, confusion, frustration, anger, but all directed away from me. Bethany's face drained of color. Her clipboard trembled in her hands. She tried to speak again, but this time her voice cracked. This is misinformation. We need a recess. The board will reconvene privately." She reached for her folder, but before she could grab it, Marcus Hale stepped forward from a corner I hadn't even realized he was standing in. His sheriff's badge glinted under the hanging lights. "Mrs. Reed," he said, voice steady and unyielding, "I think we all deserve to see the full paperwork." Bethany froze. Marcus picked up the chain of title record, skimmed it, then looked at the residents. "This is legitimate," he said. "I checked the filings myself earlier today." A ripple went through the room. Not chaos, recognition. Shift. People who had spent years bowing their heads now lifted their chins. Bethany staggered back a step. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked small, not diminished by anyone else's cruelty, just by the truth she'd refused to face. And there it was, the moment everything tipped. The block was never theirs, and they all finally knew it. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. The rain outside had stopped, but water still dripped steadily from the eaves, ticking softly against the window frames. The air inside the community hall felt thick, like everyone had collectively inhaled but forgotten how to breathe out. Then, slowly, Marcus Hale stepped further into the center of the room. His boots, still wet from the storm, left faint prints on the wooden floor as he moved. His presence changed the energy instantly. People straightened. Shoulders that had been hunched in fear for years now eased back as if someone had finally allowed them to. He held the chain of title document at his side, but even from a distance the county seal gleamed like a verdict. Bethany's face had gone pale, her lipstick vivid against skin that now looked almost gray. She clutched her clipboard in both hands as though it might anchor her to a reality she no longer controlled. "Sheriff Hale," she managed, her voice cracking. "This man is twisting old paperwork. The HOA has had authority over this lake for decades. This is a disruption of community safety." Marcus inhaled slowly, the kind of patient breath that said he had practiced restraint around her more times than he cared to admit. "Mrs. Reed," he said, voice low but carrying, "I reviewed the legal filings myself. The chain of ownership on the lakeside parcels is valid, current, and properly recorded." A couple of people in the first row let out audible exhales, shock fading into something like relief. Bethany blinked rapidly, like she was trying to boot up an argument, but couldn't find the software. "Marcus, you don't understand how these communities work. The maps we've used are not legal authority," he cut in. "Not here, not on this kind of land." She opened her mouth again, but this time no sound came out. Only a thin, shaky breath. Behind her, Harold Worthington, the HOA treasurer, rubbed his temples, his face twisted with the expression of a man wrestling with the truth and losing. Then someone from the back called out, "Sheriff, is it true we've been paying fees on land the HOA never owned?" A murmur swept across the room like a sudden gust. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me, then at Sarah, then back to the crowd. His eyes were tired. Tired in a way only men who've had to referee petty power games for too many years get. "The filings show the HOA boundaries," he said finally. "They don't include the North Shore parcels. They never have." That was all he needed to say. It was enough. More whispers. Disbelief. Frustration. The weight of years settling on these people's shoulders in new ways. Not fear this time, but realization. Bethany reached for her laminated map, flipping it open with trembling fingers. This map has guided us for 22 years. It was approved by the board and it's not the county survey," Sarah said gently. Bethany froze mid-sentence. Sarah's tone wasn't mocking. It wasn't even triumphant. It was simply factual. And that fact alone dismantled everything Bethany had built. "Maps printed by an HOA," Sarah continued, "do not override deeded land rights. They don't modify filed boundaries, and they can't rewrite the chain of title." Bethany shook her head, numb. No, this can't be right." But nobody was rushing to reassure her. Across the room, neighbors shifted in their chairs, sharing glances that carried years of pent-up anger. Anger at fines, threats, late notices, intimidation. Anger at knowing they had lived under a weight that didn't belong to them. A woman in the third row, Janice, if I remembered correctly, lifted a hand. "Sheriff," she said, voice small, "does this mean the fines we've all paid? The ones for the dock, the path, the shoreline? Does that mean those were illegal?" Bethany spun toward her. "Absolutely not. Those fines were collected without authority," Sarah said, finishing the sentence smoothly. Bethany's knees seemed to wobble for a moment. She gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. Harold finally stood. "Bethany, we need to step back. We need to look at the records." "No," she whispered. "No, you don't understand. I've kept this community safe. You've overstepped," Marcus said quietly. Another wave of murmurs filled the hall. Someone else stood, a tall man I recognized from earlier, the guy who'd watched me unload my truck. "Sheriff, can you confirm something for all of us? Who owns the access road?" Marcus nodded slowly. The recorded deed lists ownership under a private entity. That entity transferred ownership recently. Sarah opened her binder again, retrieving one more document. She placed it neatly on the table in front of the room. "You can say it," she told Marcus. He hesitated, not unsure of the facts, but aware of the weight of speaking them aloud. Then he looked at the crowd, then at me. "The access road," he said, "now belongs to Mr. Remy Cole." A hush fell so complete that I could hear the lake lapping faintly against the rocks outside. Then a single voice whispered, "He owns the entire north block." I didn't nod. I didn't shift in my seat. I simply sat still, letting the truth settle where fear had once lived. Bethany trembled. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff. This will destroy everything we've built." "A community built on fear," someone muttered. "A community built on lies," someone else added. Bethany whirled around. "I have done nothing wrong!" Her voice echoed too loudly, bouncing off the log walls. Marcus didn't flinch. "Mrs. Reed, we're going to review the HOA's actions. All of them." Her eyes flicked to the door, as though calculating escape, but all she found were neighbors, formerly intimidated, now awakening. The storm outside had passed. Inside, a new kind of storm was gathering. I stood then, slowly, letting the chair scrape back across the floor. The sound was steady, grounding. The room quieted again. "I'm not here to fight with anyone," I said softly. "I came to live by the lake, to fix up a house, to get some quiet. But I won't be bullied, and I won't let anyone else here be bullied either." Dozens of faces turned toward me, faces that had been tired, worn thin, dulled by years of being stepped on. Now they looked alive. I set the folder down on the front table beside the maps. "Everything in here is legal record. Anyone in this room can review it. You deserve to know the truth." I looked at Bethany, whose shoulders sagged beneath an invisible weight growing heavier by the minute. "This community isn't yours," I said gently. "It never was. It belongs to the people who live here, to the folks who love this lake and work these jobs and raise their kids on these shores." My voice stayed calm, steady, rooted. "And from today on," I said, "they decide what happens here, not you." Bethany stared at me, disbelief turning slowly into something close to panic. But what she felt now wasn't the end. Not yet. Because the truth about the land was only the first fracture. The truth about the money was still waiting. The community hall had settled into a heavy silence, one that felt like the air itself was bracing for impact. I could hear the faint creaking of the timber beams overhead, old pine shifting, as if the building were leaning in to listen. Outside, the storm clouds had drifted farther east, leaving behind a washed-out gray sky and the smell of wet earth drifting through the cracked windows. Sarah remained standing beside the long folding table at the front of the room. The deed documents lay spread out like pieces of an ancient map, edges curling slightly from the humidity. And there, set neatly apart from everything else, was the binder she hadn't opened yet. The financials. Bethany saw it too. Her eyes flicked to the binder, then away, then back again, like her mind couldn't stop circling the one thing she'd spent years hiding. She knew what came next, but she didn't know how much Sarah had found. Harold tugged nervously at his collar. Behind him, a handful of neighbors whispered to one another, words too soft to decipher, but heavy with suspicion. Even Marcus, usually unfazed by most chaos in the county, had taken a step closer. Sarah lifted the binder, tapping its cover lightly with her finger. "Mrs. Reed," she said, her voice steady, "we need to discuss the HOA's financial activity for the past 11 years. Bethany's reaction wasn't subtle. Her entire body stiffened. Her hands went rigid on the clipboard. She looked like someone standing on a frozen lake and hearing the first crack beneath their feet. "There is nothing wrong with our finances," she said sharply. too quickly. Everything has been reviewed and approved by the board. Harold swallowed hard. Bethany, we've never done a third-party audit. Because we didn't need one, she snapped. I've handled the books myself since... That's the problem, Sarah interrupted, flipping the binder open. Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was clinical, professional, the kind of tone that made truth sharper than shouting ever could. Rows of numbers, bank statements, and payment histories rustled as she turned to a bookmarked section. She angled the binder toward the audience, just enough for the first few rows to glimpse the documents inside. These, Sarah continued, tapping the pages, are the financial records from the HOA's accounts, obtained lawfully through discovery requests after multiple homeowners submitted concerns. Bethany's jaw tightened. Discovery? You had no right. We had every right, Sarah replied. Financial transparency is required under Wyoming statute for any homeowners association, registered or otherwise. You ignored every request. A rumble of unease traveled through the room. Richard, the man whose deck had been 6 inches too wide, stood abruptly. She told us the financials were confidential, said releasing them could expose the neighborhood to liability. Bethany shot him a glare sharp enough to cut, but it didn't silence him this time. Sarah turned another page. According to bank transactions, the HOA collected approximately $72,000 per year from dues, fines, and administrative fees. Yet only a fraction, less than 20%, was spent on actual maintenance. The room stirred. Someone cursed under their breath. What you did spend it on, Sarah said, lifting a sheet of highlighted transactions, includes payments to consulting firms that don't exist, reimbursements for executive travel, and repeated attorney retainers for neighborhood disputes, most of which involved threats sent to homeowners who disagreed with your decisions. Bethany's voice trembled now. This is taken out of context. I did what I had to do to keep order in this community. Janice from the third row stood up. You fined my husband $2,000 for painting our fence the wrong shade of brown, and then you charged us a $500 review fee to appeal it. That was policy, Bethany snapped. It wasn't legal, Sarah replied gently. More voices rose, louder now, fueled by years of being silenced. She charged me for having a canoe rack. She threatened to tow my boat because it wasn't the approved model. She billed us for a lake cleanup that never happened. Bethany clapped her hands together, a desperate bid for control. Enough! But the room didn't quiet. People had stopped fearing her. Finally, Marcus, who'd remained still through most of it, stepped closer to the table and looked at the binder himself. He traced a line of transactions with his finger, his brow furrowed, his jaw tightening. This payment here, he said slowly. Who's it made out to? Sarah angled the binder so he could read it better. Cedar Ridge Consulting. Marcus exhaled. That's not a business. That's an alias used by Judge Rodman's nephew. I've seen it in investigations before. A wave of shock rippled across the room. Judge Rodman, the same judge Bethany always name-dropped when intimidating neighbors. Bethany shook her head hard, eyes wide. You're twisting this. You're twisting everything. None of this is what it looks like. Sarah closed the binder with a quiet snap that sounded louder than it should have in that charged room. It looks, she said calmly, like the HOA has been collecting unauthorized dues and funneling money through questionable channels for over a decade. Bethany's hand shot toward the paperwork on the table as if she meant to sweep it all onto the floor, but Marcus stepped subtly between her and the documents. Don't, he warned softly. She froze. Her breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. Her perfect hair, her pristine clothes, her polished persona, none of it held power anymore, not in the face of the truth. Richard spoke again, voice trembling from a fury held too long. Sheriff, what happens now? Marcus took a breath. The county will open a formal inquiry. Potential charges include financial misconduct, embezzlement, and issuing fraudulent fines. Bethany staggered a step backward. This neighborhood needs me. Without my leadership, everything will fall apart. No, Janice whispered. It will finally be able to grow. Sarah glanced toward me, her eyes steady. She didn't need to speak. I knew this was the moment to confirm the final piece. I stepped forward. Bethany, I said quietly, this only happened because nobody ever stood up to you. Her eyes flicked to mine, wild, pleading, furious. And the worst part? I continued. You could have been a leader. You could have cared about these people. But you chose control instead. She opened her mouth, but then she shut it again because there was nothing left to say. A slow, trembling silence filled the hall. Then Marcus cleared his throat. Mrs. Reed, he said gently but firmly, I'm going to need you to stay for further questioning. Bethany blinked. Now. Now. Her clipboard slipped from her hand and clattered onto the floor. Nobody moved to pick it up. The sheriff led her to a side room where a deputy was already waiting. The door closed behind her with a soft thud. But in this room, surrounded by neighbors reclaiming their voices, that sound echoed like the end of an era. The HOA had made its final mistake, and now everything was about to change. For the first time since I'd pulled my pickup down the gravel road into this lakeside community, the room didn't feel heavy. The fear that had been pressed into the walls, years of fines, threats, whispered warnings, seemed to drain out like the last of a receding storm. People looked around at one another as though waking from a long sleep, seeing their neighbors clearly for the first time. Outside, sunlight finally broke through the thinning clouds, casting a warm beam across the wooden floor. It stretched from the doorway to the center of the room, landing right across the table where the deed documents and financial records lay scattered like artifacts from a battle already won. Harold Worthington, the treasurer who had wilted in silence for years, pulled off his glasses. His eyes were glassy, but not from tears. More from stunned relief. Is it really over? He whispered. Sarah glanced toward me, then to the others. Her voice was gentle. What Bethany built is over, but what comes next? That's yours to decide. A wash of murmurs spread through the room again, but this time they carried something entirely new. Hope. Janice stepped forward, hands clasped nervously in front of her. Sheriff, will she be charged? Marcus nodded once. The inquiry starts tonight. Paperwork, interviews, evidence review. If the forensic findings hold, and they look strong, charges will follow. And what about the money? Someone else asked. All those years of dues, all those fines, all those threats? That will be addressed, Sarah said. Once the HOA is formally frozen, the court can order restitution. A ripple of quiet satisfaction moved through the crowd. The same people who'd once hidden behind curtains whenever Bethany marched down the street were now standing taller, like the weight of her shadow had finally been peeled off their backs. I stepped around the table so they could see me clearly. I'm not here to take anyone's home, I said, voice steady. I'm not here to replace Bethany or run this community. I bought the land to protect it, from people like her, not from the people who've tried to live in peace. A few faces softened. A few nodded. Richard, the man with the too wide deck, rubbed the back of his neck. We all knew she was bad, he said quietly. Knew it for years. None of us had the guts to stand up to her. You weren't wrong, I replied. She was relentless. She had a judge in her corner. She knew how to intimidate, how to twist rules, how to make people doubt themselves. I let the silence settle for a moment. But bullies only win when nobody has the power to push back. And now they did. A soft knock sounded from the side room. The deputy cracked the door open, exchanging a glance with Marcus. The sheriff excused himself and disappeared inside. The door shut again, leaving the room in a hush. People looked at each other, uncertain. Then one by one they began to sit down, some in relief, some in exhaustion, all of them letting their bodies finally rest after years of tension wound too tight. Sarah closed the binder of financial evidence and slipped it gently into her bag. "I'll get copies for anyone who wants them," she said. "Full transparency from here on out." Harold sat heavily in a folding chair. "What do we do now? Without the HOA?" That was the question. The big one. The one hanging in the air like a flag waiting to be raised. I stepped closer. "You do what you should have been allowed to do all along," I said. "Live your lives, maintain your homes, help your neighbors when they need help instead of being told to report them." Someone in the second row asked, "But the lake, the road, the shoreline, who manages those now?" "I will," I said simply. "My company owns the parcels, but I'm not shutting anything down. The road stays open. The lake stays open. I don't want control. I want peace." A long exhale rippled through the room. For the first time, they believed it. The door to the side room opened again. Marcus stepped out, his face a blend of professionalism and weariness. He wasn't smiling, but his shoulders had dropped slightly, a sign that something had begun moving in the right direction behind that door. "Mrs. Reed will be transported to the county office," he said. "She's not under arrest at this moment, but she'll be answering questions for a while." The collective breath of the room was quieter this time, steady, accepting. Marcus turned to me. "Mr. Cole, you'll need to sign a witness statement." "Of course," Rashani said. He nodded once, grateful, then addressed the room again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll keep you informed as the investigation proceeds." He looked tired, bone-tired, but there was something clearer in his eyes now, something like closure. People began to rise, slowly gathering their things. A gentle hum of conversation filled the hall, relaxed, relieved, human. The storm had broken, and what remained was the subdued golden calm of a community piecing itself together after finally being freed. Several neighbors approached me with tentative smiles, thanking me, shaking my hand, sharing stories of their run-ins with Bethany. Stories full of frustration, but also, now, pride, because those days were over. Outside, the air had warmed. The clouds had split apart, leaving jagged patches of blue reflected in the lake's surface. The smell of pine and wet dirt carried across the breeze, wrapping the hall in the scent of cleansing. I walked back toward my cabin later that afternoon, the gravel road crunching under my boots, the lake glowing amber under the late-day sun. Sarah walked beside me, arms crossed loosely, her expression soft and thoughtful. "You did good today," she said. "So did you." She smiled, small but sincere. "Think the neighbors will be all right?" "They'll be better than all right," I said. "They finally get their lives back." As evening settled, I stood on the dock behind my cabin. The wood felt cool under my shoes, still damp from the storm. The lake spread out in front of me, calm now, a smooth mirror catching the fading orange of the sky. For the first time since arriving here, I felt the quiet I'd been searching for. The kind of quiet that wasn't fear-induced or forced, a true quiet, earned. Behind me, the cabin lights warmed the porch. Inside, the deed documents lay safely tucked away again. Silent sentinels of truth that had finally seen daylight. The neighborhood was no longer under siege. Bethany was gone. The HOA was frozen. And the water. The water looked peaceful. The lake stayed quiet. Not because someone demanded it, but because justice, finally, had room to breathe. Sometimes standing your ground is the quietest kind of courage. If you've ever dealt with an HOA or a neighbor who pushed too far, drop a justice in the comments so we know you're out there. And if you'd like more stories about land, dignity, and folks finding their voice, feel free to subscribe and stick around the porch with us.